The morning I decided to set 6 places at the dinner table, I told myself it was out of habit. 31 years of cooking for a family of 3, and the muscle memory never quite leaves you. But if I'm being honest with myself, and at 64, I've finally learned to be, I set that 6th place for Eleanor, my wife. Gone 3 years now, but still present in every room of this house, still sitting at the far end of the table in my mind every time I look up from my plate. I stood back and looked at the table. The old farmhouse oak, the one Eleanor and I found at an estate sale in Vermont the year our son Daniel was born. 35 years that table had held birthday cakes and Thanksgiving turkeys and quiet Tuesday dinners where nobody said much but nobody needed to. Now it was set for 5 or 6, depending on how you count, and in 45 minutes, my son was going to walk through that door with the woman he intended to marry. I had spent the better part of the afternoon cooking. Pot roast with carrots and pearl onions, homemade bread, apple pie cooling on the counter. Not because I was trying to impress anyone. I cooked because Eleanor always said that the way you welcome someone into your home tells them everything about who you are. I wanted whoever this woman was to know exactly who I was before she ever opened her mouth. Her name was Brianna. Daniel had told me very little, which itself told me something. 29 years old, worked in commercial real estate, grew up in Chicago. They'd been together 14 months. He'd sent me a photo once, a candid shot from what looked like a rooftop party, her laughing at something off camera. She was beautiful in the way that certain people are beautiful when they know it carefully, deliberately, like a performance. I'm not a man who judges quickly. I spent 31 years as a trauma surgeon at Mercy General in Portland, and in that work you learned fast that appearances are the least reliable information you have. What matters is what someone does when the pressure is on. So I told myself to be patient, to give her a fair chance. Daniel arrived first, alone, while Brianna parked the car. He came through the door the way he always did, shoulders slightly forward, looking around the room as if checking for hazards. He'd been doing that since he was a teenager. I never could figure out what he was bracing for. Dad. He hugged me, brief and solid. Smells incredible in here. Pot roast. Your mother's recipe. Something moved across his face. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to, I said simply. He shifted his weight. Listen, before Bree comes in, she's a little nervous. She doesn't always come across great when she's nervous. Just give her a chance, okay? I looked at my son, 33 years old, a structural engineer, smart as anyone I'd ever met. And right now he looked like a man who had already spent considerable energy managing expectations on both ends. I always give people a chance, I said. That's never been my problem. He nodded, but he didn't look entirely reassured. Brianna came through the door a minute later. She was taller than the photo suggested, dressed in a way that felt slightly too formal for a family dinner, a silk blouse, tailored trousers, heels on a hardwood floor. She scanned the room quickly, the way people do when they're cataloging rather than appreciating, and her eyes landed on me. I put out my hand. You must be Brianna. I'm Walter. It's good to finally meet you. She shook my hand with 2 fingers, the kind of handshake that signals you haven't decided yet whether the other person is worth a real one. Daniel talks about you constantly, she said, and her smile didn't quite make it to her eyes. Good things, I hope. She turned and looked around the living room. I watched her take in the house. The worn leather armchair by the window, the bookshelves that covered 2 full walls, the family photographs on the mantel, the watercolor of the Maine Coast Eleanor painted the summer before she got sick. I had always thought this house was beautiful, in the way that lived-in things are beautiful, full of time and meaning, comfortable in its own skin. Brianna's expression was the expression of someone doing math. How long have you been here? She asked. 38 years. Eleanor and I bought it when Daniel was a baby. It's very, she paused, cozy. There are words that people use as compliments when they mean something else entirely. Cozy is one of them. I let it pass. We sat down to dinner. For the first 20 minutes, things were surface-level polite. Brianna asked me careful questions about my retirement, nodding at my answers without fully listening to them, the way people do at networking events. I asked her about her work. She lit up talking about commercial real estate, the projects she was developing, the neighborhoods she was reshaping. She was clearly good at her job, ambitious in the way that I respected, even if I didn't yet respect her. It was during the pot roast that things shifted. "I have to ask," Brianna said, setting down her fork with a small click. "And I hope this doesn't come across wrong, because I'm really coming from a practical place." She glanced at Daniel, who was watching his plate. "This house, what do you estimate it's worth now? In this market?" I took a slow sip of water. I haven't thought much about it. Because I looked it up, I hope you don't mind. Professional habit and properties in this area, with this square footage and lot size, are moving for anywhere between $650 and $720. She tilted her head. That's a significant asset for someone living alone. The table was very quiet. "I suppose it is," I said. "And it's a lot of upkeep for one person." She smiled. "I only bring it up because Daniel and I have been thinking about our future, and we'd love to have a real conversation about how everyone's assets can be working harder. It just makes sense. From a planning perspective." I looked at my son. He was cutting his meat with great concentration. "What kind of conversation did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well," she leaned forward slightly. "We've been looking at a place, a condo actually, downtown. Beautiful building, 2 units on the same floor, which would be ideal. You'd have your own space, but we'd be right there. And Daniel mentioned you've been talking about simplifying anyway. So, Daniel mentioned that?" My son finally looked up. Something in his face was complicated. "I might have said you seemed a little lonely out here." "Since Mom." I set down my fork. 31 years in an operating room teaches you a particular kind of stillness. When everything is going wrong at once, when the monitors are screaming and someone's life is literally in your hands, you learn to go very quiet inside. I went quiet inside now. "That's thoughtful of you both," I said, "but I'm not interested in selling the house." Brianna's smile stayed in place, but something behind it recalibrated. "Of course, there's no pressure. It's just, and I want to be honest with you, because I think that's more respectful than dancing around things. Daniel and I were hoping to potentially use the equity here as a bridge to cover the down payment on the condo, both units. It would be a short-term loan arrangement, obviously, fully documented." "How much are we talking about?" "Roughly 300,000. I looked at her. Then I looked at my son. Daniel said quietly, "You could think about it, Dad." The apple pie sat cooling on the counter, and I thought about Eleanor, and I thought about the 38 years of my life that had happened inside these walls. The night Daniel had a febrile seizure at age 2 and we raced him to the hospital, Eleanor riding in the back of the ambulance holding his tiny hand. The evening we sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine, and she told me she'd found a lump. The long months that followed. The last Christmas. The chair at the end of the table, where she no longer sat. "No," I said. Brianna blinked. "No? No, I won't be selling the house, or providing a loan, and I think we should change the subject." The room went to a different kind of quiet. Brianna set her napkin on the table with a precision that felt pointed. "I understand you're attached to the house, but I want to make sure you're thinking about this practically. You're 64. You're alone. This is a significant amount of house for one person, and from a purely financial standpoint, Brianna." I said her name calmly, the way I used to say a patient's name in recovery when I needed their full attention. "I've spent 31 years making very high-stakes practical decisions. I promise you I'm capable of assessing my own situation." "What did you do?" she asked, and the question had an edge to it now. Not curiosity, more like a challenge. "I was a surgeon." Something flickered in her expression, just for a moment. Then the polished surface closed back over it. "Retired, though," she said. "There's a real difference between what you could handle at 50 and what makes sense at 64. My own father struggled with that transition." "I'm sorry to hear that. I'm just saying, pride can cost people a lot." Daniel said her name under his breath. "I'm not offended," I said to him. Then to her, "Would anyone like pie?" The rest of the dinner was a performance of normalcy that everyone understood to be a performance. We talked about Daniel's current project, a pedestrian bridge outside of Burlington. We talked about the weather coming in from the coast. Brianna's parents were driving up from Connecticut the following weekend, she mentioned, and the 4 of them were planning to have dinner together before the drive back. Daniel looked at me when she said this. "Maybe they could stop by here," I said, "if they'd like." Brianna looked like she was about to say something, then thought better of it. "Sure, I'll mention it." After they left that night, I stood in the kitchen, and washed the dishes by hand the way I always did. Through the window above the sink, the October sky was full of stars. I thought about what Daniel had said. "You seemed a little lonely out here." I thought about how well we can misread the people we love. I wasn't lonely. I was quiet. There's a profound difference, and it's one I'd tried to teach him when he was young, though it seemed the lesson hadn't fully taken. The next morning I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who I'd worked with for years. I asked her about establishing a revocable living trust for the house. She told me to come in Thursday. I drove to her office and spent 2 hours making sure that the home Eleanor and I had built together was protected in exactly the way it needed to be. Patricia was thorough and she was good, and when we were done, I felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't fully noticed was tight. I also updated my will, not out of anger, out of clarity, because clarity, I found, is the thing that comes when you stop letting other people's agendas cloud your own vision. The week passed. I went on my morning walks. I read. I had coffee with my neighbor Gordon, who was 72 and growing the most remarkable tomatoes I'd ever seen for this late in the season. I called Daniel twice. He answered both times but kept the conversation short, and I could hear Brianna's presence in the background, even when she wasn't speaking, in the way he chose his words, in the things he didn't say. On Friday afternoon, Daniel called to say they were on their way. Brianna's parents, Richard and Sylvia, would be joining us. "Just a brief stop," he said. "An hour at most." They were on a schedule. I made coffee and set out the good cups. I put on a clean shirt, and I set the table in the living room with the same care I set every table, because Eleanor taught me that how you receive people reflects who you are, and I intended to be exactly who I was. They arrived at 4:30. I heard the car doors and then footsteps on the porch, and then Daniel opened the front door and held it for Brianna and her parents. I walked in from the kitchen, and I saw them, Richard and Sylvia. A man about my age, silver-haired and slightly stooped in the way that years of worry sometimes stoops a person. A woman with Brianna's bone structure and careful eyes, wearing a blue coat, holding a tin of cookies she'd clearly brought as a gesture of goodwill. I saw them, and I watched their faces change. Sylvia stopped walking. The tin of cookies trembled slightly in her hands. Richard put his hand on the doorframe, and I thought for a moment he might need it to hold himself up. It was Sylvia who spoke first. Her voice came out broken at the edges. "My God," she whispered. "Is it you? Is it really you?" Brianna turned to her mother. "Mom, what—" "Walter Reed," Richard said. Not a question. A recognition, like a man saying the name of something he thought he'd never see again. I looked at them both, and then it came to me. The way these things come to you, not all at once, but in layers, the mind pulling out an old file, blowing the dust off. 22 years ago, a Sunday afternoon in early November, a 7-car pileup on Interstate 95 south of Portland. I had been called in on my day off because they needed every trauma surgeon available. They brought in 11 patients in 4 hours. I lost count of the cases. You don't remember them as individuals. In those moments, you remember them as problems to be solved, bodies to be stabilized, bleeding to be stopped. You do your job, and then you go home, and you sit very still for a while before you can sleep. But there was one. A young woman, 23, 24 at the most, brought in by a couple in their late 40s who were not her parents but had stopped their car and pulled her from the wreck before the fire reached her. She had a splenic laceration, a fractured pelvis, a collapsed lung. She had lost a tremendous amount of blood. The couple sat in the waiting room for 7 hours. I remember going out to them when it was over, and the woman, silver-haired even then, or beginning to be, grabbed my hand in both of hers and could not speak. That woman was Sylvia. That young woman on the table was Brianna. "I remember you," I said quietly. Sylvia crossed the room and took both of my hands the way she had done 22 years ago, and her eyes were full. "We never found you. After the hospital, they said you'd retired, and we tried, but—" her voice broke. "We never got to thank you properly." "You don't have to thank me. That's what I was there for." "She almost died," Richard said. His voice was rough. "You were on the phone with us the whole time after, explaining everything, staying late. You didn't have to do any of that." Brianna had gone very still. She was standing slightly apart from the rest of us, and I could see her face working through something difficult in private. She looked at her parents, And then she looked at me, and then she looked away at nothing in particular. "You saved her," Sylvia said. "You saved our daughter." There was a long moment. Daniel was watching all of this with an expression I couldn't fully read: disbelief, and something underneath it that was more complicated, something that had to do with realizing you don't know a person as well as you thought. "I did my job," I said. "I'm glad it worked." Sylvia shook her head. "We used to tell Brianna about you. We didn't know your name, just the surgeon, the one who stayed. She was unconscious. She doesn't really." She stopped. "She doesn't remember." I looked at Brianna. She was looking at the floor now. Her arms were crossed, not in the defensive way she'd worn them at the dinner table last week, but in the way of someone who is trying to hold themselves together. When she finally looked up at me, her face had lost all of its performance. She looked, for the first time since I'd met her, like a person rather than a presentation. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was quiet and unsteady. "I didn't remember you." "You were in a lot of pain," I said. "That tends to block things out. I said things to you last week that were—" She stopped, swallowed. "I wasn't kind to you." "No," I agreed. "You weren't." Daniel made a small sound. "But people aren't always kind when they're afraid," I said. "And I think you were afraid of a lot of things." She looked at me. I saw the scar, then the one just below her collarbone, barely visible above the collar of her shirt. The kind of scar that fades over 2 decades but never fully disappears. I had made that incision. The thought sat in me strangely, the way those things do. The threads that run between people without their knowledge. "I owe you an apology," Brianna said. "A real one." "You do," I said. "And I'll accept it, but I want to say something first." She waited. "I don't need you to love this house. I don't need you to understand why I'm staying in it. But my son has built his life here, too. In a way, every memory he has of his mother is in these walls. And I need the woman he marries to understand that some things aren't assets, they're anchors. There's a difference." I paused. "Do you understand that?" She looked at me for a long moment. "I think I'm starting to." "That's enough for now." We had coffee. Sylvia had brought ginger snaps in the tin, and they were excellent, and I told her so. Richard sat in the leather armchair by the window and talked to me about the drive up from Connecticut, about the leaves turning along the highway, about the way New England could still surprise you every fall, even after a lifetime of falls. He was a decent man. I liked him. Daniel sat next to Brianna on the couch, and at some point during the conversation she reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their hands and then up at her, and something passed between them that was private and real, not performed for anyone's benefit. After an hour, they stood to leave. Sylvia hugged me at the door with the kind of fullness that people usually reserve for family, and I let her, because it seemed like something she had been carrying for 22 years and needed to put down. At the door, Brianna paused. She had her coat on and her keys in her hand. She looked at me with the new expression she'd been wearing for the past hour, the unguarded one. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The extra place setting," she said. "At dinner last week, there were 6 places for 5 people. I noticed, but I didn't say anything." I looked at her. Then I looked past her at the table, the old farmhouse oak, the chair at the far end. "That's Eleanor's place," I said simply. "She's always at the table." Brianna's eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Once. Then she stepped forward and did something I didn't expect. She put her arms around me briefly, the way you hug someone you've hurt and are sorry for having hurt, and then she stepped back and walked down the porch steps to where Daniel and her parents were waiting. I stood in the doorway and watched the car back out of the drive. The late October air was cold and clean and smelled of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. The maples along the fence line had gone full red and gold, and in the blue-gray evening light they looked almost painted. I went back inside. I cleared the coffee cups and washed them at the sink. I stood at the window for a while, the way I often did, watching the dark come down over the yard. I thought about the 11 patients from that Sunday afternoon 22 years ago. I could not tell you the names of most of them. I could not tell you what became of them, whether they healed fully or partially or not at all, whether they went on to live good lives or difficult ones, whether the hours I spent with my hands inside their bodies made any difference to the long arc of who they became. That's the thing about the work I did. You rarely get to know the end of the story. You do what needs to be done, and then the person is wheeled out of your operating room, and the door swings shut, and you scrub out, and the next case comes in. You don't get closure. You get the satisfaction of the work itself, and you learn to let that be enough. But sometimes, not often, life brings the story back around. Sometimes the door swings open again, and you find out what happened to the person on the other side of it. And it is a strange and humbling thing to discover that the moment you barely remember, that Sunday afternoon, case 7 of 11, a young woman with a collapsed lung and a fighting chance, was a pivot point in someone else's life. That she grew up and became someone, flawed and ambitious and frightened of things she couldn't name, and that she found her way to my son, of all the people in the world, and that she sat at my table and looked at me without recognizing me, and was unkind. Life doesn't move in straight lines. I've known that for a long time, but it still surprises me, the shape of it, the way threads connect things you thought were separate, the way the past keeps its hold on the present long after you've stopped looking. I looked at the chair at the far end of the table. "Well," I said quietly. Eleanor, I thought, would have found this extraordinary. She would have sat with me in the kitchen after everyone left, and poured us each a small glass of whiskey, and said something wise and a little bit funny about the nature of things, about how the world was stranger and more connected than any of us gave it credit for. She was good at that, seeing the wonder in the strange turns. I missed her in the specific way. I always missed her, not like an absence, so much as a presence that had shifted form. Still here, still present, just changed. I turned off the kitchen light. I checked the locks. I walked through the house the way I walk through it every night, touching the door frames out of habit, making sure everything was in its place. The bookshelves, with their 30 years of accumulated reading, the watercolor of the Maine coast, the farmhouse table, 6 chairs, 5 of them for the living and 1 for the woman who made this house what it was, and still sat at its head in every way that mattered. I stood at the foot of the stairs and looked back at the dining room. I had built something here, not just a house, a life, the kind that accumulates meaning slowly and without fanfare, the kind that doesn't look like much from the outside until you understand what went into it. I had not built it to be an asset. I had built it to be a home. Nobody was going to take that from me. Not out of pressure, not out of guilt, not out of someone else's vision of what made practical sense. And if the woman my son loved was going to be part of this family, if she was going to sit at this table and build her own memories in these rooms, she was going to have to understand that. I thought she was starting to. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail. Outside the window at the top of the landing, the October stars were out, cold and clear above the tree line. I stood there for a moment, looking up at them, the way I had stood at hundreds of windows over the years, at the end of long days, catching my breath before the next one. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in several weeks I slept well.